I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor. We're so pleased to welcome Jacinda Townsend in support of Mother Country to launch it. Today's publication day and to be in conversation with author Peter Ho Davies. Just a quick webinar overview once again for those of you who are just joining us before I turn it over to tonight's author and our moderator. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase the book throughout the event there in the chat. You can also use the Q&A feature, though, to submit questions that you might have for Jacinda at any time. I'll read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. And live transcription is available should you need it on your toolbar as well. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You can also subscribe to our channel to be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events when they become available there. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public. But most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, or much later this evening, depending on where and when in the world you are joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator this evening. Jacinda Townsend is the author of Saint Monkey, which won the Janet Heidinger Kafka Prize and the James Fenimore Cooper Prize. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and teaches in the MFA program at the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. Speaking with her this evening, Peter Ho Davies is the author of 3 novels, including A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself and 2 story collections. The winner of the Ansfield Wolf Award and the Penn Malamud Prize. He teaches as well at the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Jacinda Townsend and Peter Ho Davies into your living rooms.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Jacinda. It's so great to be here with you.
Oh, it's so nice. I have admired your work for like literal decades. So it's really nice to be in conversation with an author whose work kind of informs mine. So thanks for talking.
That's very kind. I am, as I was saying to you in the green room, I'm just thrilled to talk about this fantastic book, which I read not just with deep pleasure, but with a kind of awe, actually, the imagination. I'm really looking forward to getting into the conversation as we go forward. And congratulations on publication day. It's fantastic to be talking about this on the day the book comes out as well. So it's a really nice moment for me as a reader, but I hope you're enjoying it as well for you as a writer. Oh, I should add just briefly, not just thanks to John for setting us up there so nicely, but also thanks to Literati, the bookstore, who are partnering with me and a bunch of other writers across the country in an initiative called Book the Vote. It's basically just an initiative to register voters at bookstores and libraries in the run-up to the midterms in the fall. Non-partisan effort, I should say. And John's going to put some links to Book the Vote, and also I think to a page where people can register to vote in Michigan if they're Michigan residents as well. So just wanted to get that out of the way before we get rolling. But Jacinda, I think, if I'm not much mistaken, you have some plans maybe to read for us.
I do. But first, I just want to, thank you and everybody who's doing Book the Vote. I think today is one of those days where we know how important that is, and I always feel like writers are among the few people who are sort of required to step out of our skins and into other people's skins and then step back into our skins with their experiences and sort of transmit that to everybody. So who better to, spearhead a political effort? So that is awesome. I am going to read from the part of the novel. There are 2 protagonists in Mother Country. One is American, one is Mauritanian. And I'm going to read from the part, a few pages, where the Mauritanian woman escapes slavery. In Tazanacht, where the caravan stopped, Surya found a large, kind family of sheep farmers who needed help butchering. They were Amazigh, could not communicate with her, and did not try. They spoke encouragement to her in their own language, and when she at last sliced cleanly through a tendon with a single stroke of her blade, gave her a chorus of approval. The mother of this family was short, thin, and nervous. She chewed gum all day, and every few hours she'd walk to a small dying tree on the property to affix her used gum to its bark. The tree was covered with pink and green dots, such that when the woman stood next to it, Surya could see how the gum started at the height of her ankles and ended just above the crown of her head. Surya wondered whether the gum was killing the tree or if the woman had chosen to torment a tree that was already ill. The father of the family had exactly 7 teeth, all of them in the bottom of his mouth. He had one good eye and one wandering eye that sometimes rolled to focus on her. And when she had occasion to look at him, when she handed him a pair of goat ears or the slick liver pulled from a sheet's insides, she made a point of looking at his poor, unloved eye, the one the rest of the world never watched. The father, perceiving and understanding Surya didn't actually have, spoke to her in his language, sometimes gesticulating wildly and even blooming to anger ahead of the thesis of his one-sided conversations. Ashkatfer, he'd say in conclusion, then spit as though she'd responded. Surya listened and sometimes even grunted in agreement. The mother and the father had 8 children between them, and the older children helped with the slaughter while the younger 3 climbed in the argan trees. At night, they roasted goat meat over a desert fire. The younger children sang, and the mother stood on her knees in the middle of their circle and danced Gedra. Between key changes, the father pressed on with his vitriol, though everyone else ignored her. She stayed the 2 days until the town market, where she inserted herself in the line for a bus heading north. The bus turned curves and passed along mountains, and she grew so angry with nausea that when at last the bus pulled into its gate at Babdukala and stopped, she shouldered her way past an old grandfather to disembark first. He yelled at her in his language and kept yelling until a middle-aged woman who'd been standing along the brown brick wall of the gar came over to tell him to stop. Released from his noise, Surya looked over the woman's shoulder and saw the wide concrete path, the people zooming by on mopeds, buses and cars belching smoke as they shifted gears. The city was more frightening than Surya had thought it might be. It was a colossus. So, and I should say that Surya she's a nomad, and she's from a nomadic culture. So in some sense, when she leaves the desert and gets to Morocco, it's a feeling she's kind of used to, but not at all used to, because it's suddenly the world, the citified world that she's coming into.
No, I love that passage. It's funny how that image of the woman putting the used gum on the tree. The tree is incredibly vivid to me. I think what's so amazing about those sequences in the book. They feel distant and yet incredibly immediate and vivid in the writing as well. So I'm fascinated and hope we can get a chance to talk about this as we go on, to see how you pulled that off, because that's part of the awe I feel in regard to the book. But maybe starting more broadly, and maybe starting a little bit in a sense with the beginning. I know that the title Mother Country has gone through some revisionary changes. Maybe we can talk about that as we go forward. But I have to say, I love that title. It feels as though it captures 2 essential thematic spaces and subject materials for the book. Motherhood, which we'll talk about a little bit as we go on. Surya and Shannon, both mothers in various ways. But also that sense of country, that sense of place. And I think the way you were talking about Surya as coming from a nomadic family, there's a lovely line, I think at some point in the text, of the way so many of the characters, and I think it's true of lots of them, whether they're exiles, expatriates, whether they're kidnapped, whether they're trafficked, they talk about a kind of cosmic homelessness. And so the idea of place and home feels really important in the book. And maybe the place I wanted to start with, first of all, was a place that I think you have a long relationship with, which is Morocco, where a lot of the action takes place. And I think you mentioned somewhere that you've gone back 20 years. I was there once for like 4 days, 35 years ago, and it was bringing it back in incredibly vivid ways. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to Morocco and stuff.
Sure. So my relationship with Morocco came about rather by accident. I was doing a Fulbright in Cote d'Ivoire, and my then husband lived in New York City. So the flight always stopped in Casablanca from Abidjan to New York. So one of those times, and this was back, before 9/11, when you could do anything you wanted, I just extended the layover for 4 days. And my mind was just blown. I took the Marrakesh Express from Casa to Marrakesh and had the song playing in my head the whole time, and um, it was the furthest culturally I had ever been from the United States. I mean, including, sub-Saharan Africa. It was somehow even more culturally far from that. And then I discovered that, Casablanca and Marrakesh were like two entirely different planets. So I began to go back when my older kid was a toddler, basically. She was 2 the first time we went. And then we went to a little town called Essaouira, which is where a lot of the book takes place. And again, it was kind of like I discovered a whole other planet, So we've been back, gosh, I've been back about 9 times. My kids have kind of grown up there in a lot of ways in the summer. And, the Morocco, I always joke, it's like an abusive spouse, 2 out of the 3 days, it's going to be a hard time. but we find so much magic there that we always want to go back. And this kind of has to do with the evolution of the title as well, because I do have such a fondness, for Morocco. But as you know, it's one of the American, probably the American who is most well known for writing about Morocco is Paul Bowles. And it's interesting, when I read his work, there's so much phobia in that work, and it's stunning to me because I think he lived there for a total of 27 years. But I felt like to some extent, I wanted to write an account of Morocco that is not at all sort of xenophobic or Islamophobic or, all the isms that is in that older work. Because I think, to some extent, the sort of an American's experience of Morocco that was colored by sort of the sensibilities we had back then has dramatically changed. But also it's a different experience when you're an expatriate who is not only of color, but Muslim. And so I wanted to write that, from sort of like the inside. And so I titled it Kef, which was kind of a play on, Paul Bowles' Hashish, which he translated. But that title is now just the license plate on my car. And I resisted that, but I also like Mother Country because of what you said, Peter. It's like we have these 2 women who to some extent don't belong in either of the spaces they're in, but they kind of make their way to motherhood as a space. It's an uneasy space for both of them in a lot of ways, but they do make their way there, and that's their country, I think, in the end.
Yeah, no, I love that sense. And I think you mentioned it when we were chatting once before, that sense of the book as maybe not quite directly a reply to, but it's conscious of that history of Bowles and Sheltering Sky and things like that. And it just really did feel like it spoke back to that and pushed that away in some way. So it felt as though, that now quite dated, I think, sense I have through literature of the Moroccan space now feels actually quite nicely supplanted by the richness and the depth and the vividness of what's here on the page. I really love that. There's a great description, I think, of Morocco, maybe of Marrakesh itself, as both psychedelic and ancient, and that feels just right. It was recalling to me, at least some of my own brief memories in those regards. I think that raises really interesting questions. It's this feeling, you and I are both very aware of this in our teaching, something that our students are thinking into as well, the difficulties, the challenges, practically, ethically, of writing about distant spaces. And so I think that sense of you having this long relationship with Morocco speaks into that territory, and it does feel as though that's very felt on the page. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit also about the wonderful ways in which I think, and we could hear it a little bit there in that passage you read, do you occupy Souria's point of view? There's a great deal of her history. And it feels as though, for me, what was magical about the book was that, and I love this in literature generally, that sort of sense of being transported into a landscape of somebody distant from me, but in a very intimate and very close way. And I know how difficult that must have been. And so I'm curious about, I think in the the acknowledgements, there's mention of translators and some organizations that you worked with, but I'm curious about research, what went into that inhabitation.
Sure. So this, her story started out as kind of actually both women's stories, and the two stories that sort of form the foundation of this book started out as sort of painful moments for me. But the one that is Saria's story, the more sort of political story, is arose out of some work I was doing in Mauritania. Actually, I was writing for Al Jazeera an article about women in development. And I met up with a couple of anti-slavery activists there. There are two sort of competing organizations, and I was hosted by both of them, which was really, really lovely. And the woman I was writing about introduced me to a family of slaves. And, the painful part of that moment was to really understand the sort of magnitude of what this woman and her family had been through. This woman had escaped slavery with 8 children. All of these 8 children were products of rape, because her master had leased her out, kind of. But the kind of less painful part, or kind of a happy part of the story, actually, of this woman's story, is that she gave birth on her way out of the desert during the escape. She gave birth to the 8th kid. That 8th kid, when I got to Mauritania, was still an infant, so I got to hold her. It was the most powerful moment because I mean, I can't imagine what this feels like, but vicariously, I got to sort of hold the first person in that family to ever be born outside of slavery, because it is a caste-based thing in Mauritania. And one thing that people don't know is that 20% of the population of Mauritania is enslaved, and it's brutal. It's actually a brutal sort of form of slavery. It wasn't outlawed in that country till 2008. I think as of now, they've prosecuted maybe not even 2 handfuls of cases, that they've prosecuted. So it just continues and continues. One of the reasons it continues is that there's one television station there, and it's state-owned. So you have a population of people who are sort of subject in some sense to just a lack of information. So what that and I'm getting around to answering your question. Sorry.
No, this is great. I'm fascinated.
What that translates into is this idea that I carried with me. Someone told me as I was traveling that slaves often feel like it is the will of Allah that they are enslaved, which is probably the main reason that it's hard to escape slavery, is because so many people believe they shouldn't. And so I started kind of with that idea that this character was not only a stranger in a strange land when she gets to Morocco, but in some sense, she is a stranger to any kind of thought that is outside of that very narrow constraint. The hardest part of writing her for me is that she's illiterate. That was so much more difficult than I imagined it would be. But this is a character who doesn't really know how the moon works. It comes up, it goes down. She assumes that this is magic, and she, in some ways, it was it's difficult to get in her head because she believes a lot is magic. She's very superstitious, but the illiteracy was extremely hard. It was made easier by the fact that my Arabic reading skills are pretty terrible. So I could kind of imagine that, but it was, it was interesting to write her,
It's funny because, one of the beauties of that scene you read is I feel that there are lots of moments in the sort of epic journey that she goes through, which is, harrowing and challenging, but also does, you reminded me of this when you were talking about holding that first child born out of slavery. There are also these moments of incredible light and moments of, what feel like small but modest, but also in the context of this life, incredibly powerful moments of kindness as well that come up as well. So it's to coin a cheesy phrase, it's an emotional roller coaster ride, but incredibly satisfying as a reader in those ways. But it was making me think there are moments when she encounters people whose language she doesn't speak, or she only speaks partially, or she's actually learning her way into that. And as a writer, I thought, well, that's very difficult because we're cut off from the recourse of scenes of dialogue, I think, in many ways. And yet you're fantastic at, I think it's in that detail of her looking at the one ruined eye of the man she's talking to as they're butchering the sheep. Bits of body language feel as though we feel dialogue and communication going on between these characters. And that's part of, I think, that sense of being able to see the narrative, even if we can't access the language that the characters can't themselves exchange.
Yes. And I wanted to really explore that too, that there is so much that you're cut off from when you're cut off from people via language. I think of how, in different languages, we're different people, right? We're different versions of ourselves depending on what language we're speaking. And so in some sense, both these characters kind of get cut off from their persons for a while, but then they have to see the world anew. They have to watch that body language. They have to sort of learn the culture that way, through the body, through things that are taking place around them.
You're reminding me of a fantastic, it's deft, almost throwaway, but it's just a dead-on line, I think, about Shannon and her husband, Vlad, who are in Morocco, and there's this idea of them living the version of their marriage as if it were in a French movie in some ways, or some kind of foreign movie. And there's that sense of displacement that feels very true to a kind of expatriate experience, that's that unmooring of something. And it just feels like you nailed that. But as I say, I think it's sort of embedded in all the various different kinds of homelessness the characters experience, and even perhaps a kind of alienation, even if it's not even from a physical location of place and home, but even within a family, of parents who might not be offering the emotional home that a character might look for in certain ways as well. Maybe that brings us a little bit to Shannon herself, sort of an American protagonist of this narrative, who is part of the expatriate scene in Morocco. And I'm curious about how you thought yourself into her as a character as well. She seems on the one hand a little closer to home, but she's so distinct, I think, and the behaviors that she goes through also feel as though they ought to push us away, and yet they also feel persuasive and strangely compelling and sympathetic, even ultimately, as the story goes on.
Yeah, she and I love reading your book about revision because it's so spot on. She started out as a completely different character, and then I got to the end of the first draft, and I was like, this woman is kind of boring me a little.
She's nothing like that now, I can tell you.
So I thought, what is the one thing that I can't relate to that I can put on her, and it was the weed habit. Once I gave her this raging weed habit, everything became clear. The plot became clear. She became way more clear, and I think like the part of this that's quite intensely personal has to do with her, in that when both of my kids, I had envisioned having them in like a bucket of water, and like Bambi was going to come out and talk to me while I was giving birth, and it was going to be like beautiful. It wasn't like that at all. They were both born via C-section, actually, and it took me years, Peter, to feel like I was a proper mother. I felt like I had kind of bought into this whole cosmology about, that moment, that defining moment. And I wondered, okay, so if you spool that out to the nth degree, and somebody actually stole a child, how long would it take that person to feel like a mother? And when I got to the end of the first draft and I figured that that's what the book is about, it kind of made me have to go back and give her all these other attributes, so that it's like, not only has she done this thing, this very outre thing, but she has a history of not only failure, but people making her feel like a failure. Although, and we're both Star Wars fans, in her defense, I want to quote Lando Calrissian and say, she did the best she could do, but she had her own problems.
It's funny. I had not really thought of Lando as offering a motto for motherhood or parenthood, but I think that's right on. That's spot on. Absolutely.
So she has all these, she has student loan debt, she has medical debt. She has now, she and her husband have now spent $50,000 on IVF treatment, and she sees this child and she just kind of loses her way for a moment, and it becomes a defining moment for all of these people. But there is a chapter, and I want to read a little bit of it, because there's a chapter that's kind of about how we all do that, that we can all sort of get more, we can adopt this moral relativism when it suits us. So this is a chapter where we hear from several different characters who sort of witness the abduction, and it's in second person, and they all sort of have their reasons for having ignored it. So I'll just read a little bit from the first voice there. You didn't grieve your son's death, not for 1 full year, because you didn't realize he was dead. You went to the burial, you tucked your head into Driss's shoulder and wept, but it wasn't a weeping for the loss of your son, because at any moment your son was going to come running back through the front door of your house saying, Umi, I want a drink of water. You were weeping because of the hysteria all around you. You were weeping because the wind cut so cold against your chest. You were weeping because the words of the imam sounded so crisp and insensitive against the wailing of your own mother. Or more honestly, you didn't know why you were weeping. You found the tears there in your eyes, felt them brimming over until they were running down your cheeks. And once they fell, it was such a relief that you found you could not stop. But you didn't understand why your son had died. And so you didn't understand that he had died. And you weren't bitter, not once in that year, because your arms still held the muscle memory of him. And for you, he was not gone. He'd just wandered off and fallen off a ledge between houses. And you didn't know either how he'd even climbed up there, which made it improbable that the fall had actually happened. But in some other plane of existence, he fell, and he made enough of a fuss that you went out to the side yard and scooped him up. And then I'll skip ahead a little for time's sake. So when this young mother shows up at Nasser's shop, this young mother had seen trouble, you could tell. And then when her fiddler went off to gendarmerie school is what Nasser told you and your husband. And though the young mother would come out to stand in front of Nasser's shop from time to time, looking from left to right as though she were lost, she kept the taller walk that life had given her. She still crossed her arms nervously across her breasts, but now the arms seemed looser, more hopeful. So when the American woman came and took her child down the alley, repeating her question of ice cream, you didn't think twice about it. The woman with her big boxy shoulders was so obviously American. She had a deep gash that something had riven on one side of her face, yet she was still beautiful with curly black hair and brown skin, and she seemed full of peace and light, delightful, like almost all of the Black American women who came in your shop. So what you really think is that the American woman saw the sheer delight in the girl's face, and she decided that the child should indeed have ice cream every hour of every day, and she took her back to the United States to make this happen. And you convince yourself that this is the best way, that no matter what this little girl loses in the bargain, she will have escaped this bedraggled life in her mother's little flat, and that the young mother will be free to marry her fiddler. And even if that isn't the way, there's nothing you can do for the young mother by telling her what's happened to her child. And so you say nothing. You listen to the young mother's cries and the alarm of your husband. You touch your heart and you cry with her, but you say nothing. If you can turn over your dead son to Allah, this young woman who's too young to even be a mother can surely turn her daughter over to a rich American. It is Nia, it is obedience, it is the divine plan of Allah to be unwritten by no human hand. And yes, there are many people who ignored this kidnapping, and they have their reasons.
But also, I mean, it supports this thing that feels as though we want to think this is impossible, but the way you so carefully chart the way people are variously implicated or let it go or see it but see in a different way really carries us over that our resistance to believing in it. You carry us over that wonderfully. And actually, you're reminding me too of, while in my mind's eye, the book is very much the sort of braided narrative of Shannon and Surya going back and forth. That last third of the book has this wonderful sort of polyphonic quality, right? Signaled, I think, by that chapter where we get lots of different voices in that space. But also as we move on, we get in a wonderful sequence, the daughter's voice coming in as well in those spaces as well. And so there's that real feeling of, as I think that passage was making me think about, and maybe this takes us back to Shannon too, experiences in a larger way of motherhood and daughterhood, actually, in some ways as well, right? It feels as though, for all of what Shannon may be doing feels out there and exceptional, there are also ways in which some of the experience feels universal, right? That she's got a wonderful line, which is just about every damn thing was every mother's fault, right? Which feels just like the way we think into parenthood when we're in the midst of it, right? So she has her own particular reasons for thinking that, but that feels like a recognizable observation. And there's some other moment later on where she talks about parenthood as a kind of, or motherhood, I think she's thinking about especially as a kind of masquerade, and a bit like an ill-fitting Halloween costume, which feels just right. And I was recognizing that as a father, as a parent, in very different circumstances, but sort of it felt as though you touched upon that deep vein of anxiety, a kind of imposter syndrome that we feel as parents, because in a certain sense, that passage from our lives as non-parents to those lives as parents does feel like we've entered some kind of foreign alien country to us. I think in certain ways, we're not quite sure we recognize ourselves, not quite sure if we're natives to that space as we enter into it. All of this is making me think, though, a little bit. I did notice, I've done this myself, so I think I'm prone to this. The book is dedicated to your daughters. You thank them first for their inspiration in the acknowledgements. And I guess it's something I obsess about a little bit, but not alone. I know a lot of writers who think into this space. There is occasionally that tension between reconciling our roles as parents and our roles as writers. And I was wondering how you've thought into that, in the process of both writing about motherhood in this context.
Yes. And I'm so curious to know whether your son has read your book about fatherhood. Has he?
He has not. He knows he can. It's available to him. But he has shown little interest in doing that, which I think is psychologically fairly healthy. So I'm not pushing him by any means. He's read some of my other work. And when he was younger, he liked the idea that certain books were dedicated to him. So I think he likes to know that, but I'm not sure that he's desperate to read into those spaces yet. How about your girls?
They have read a little bit of my first novel. This one, it's funny you ask this one. I'm a little.
That's a great reaction.
This one. I'm reading it because, in part because I think that I think our kids are lucky, Peter, that we're writers and they know that the world is sort of French and grumpy, and that I think as a culture we sort of enshrine parenthood, and we want to pretend that there isn't this reality that Mickey Mouse actually takes his little hood off and he's smoking a cigarette. I mean, what I mean? But
that sounds like a great trip to Disneyland. I didn't know that was an option.
So much of this book is about sort of exploding that. It's an incredibly hard undertaking when you transfer from that world to the next. Although I think you and I are both at this place too, where we're learning how hard it is to go from being a parent to being a parent of a child who's going, that's maybe a harder transition, right? But yeah, I think, and I'm so glad the book, it wasn't, I think it may have been a little accidental that the book is coming out ahead of Mother's Day, but we all we all feel that on these holidays. This sort of the tension there between what is portrayed in our culture, what we really feel that we're not going to say out loud, the ways that culture sort of makes it difficult for us to say either thing, actually, or act upon either thing, and so I had a lot of question in writing this, like, what happens to the self when you become a parent? What happens to the self? I think Shannon has a very hard time deciding what is going to happen to the self, but we all have to figure out where does that go? What space do we put it in? So
yeah, it's really, what I'm loving about it, I think, and this is such a wonderful space that fiction can enter into, is that in a sense for both of them, and actually also for the passage from that mother that you were reading about who loses a child, there's an exploration of worst case scenarios, right? What if I stole a child? What if I lost a child? What if I had a child stolen from me? So these feel like extremities of parenthood, our worst fears or our worst behaviors.
yeah,
and yet somehow this nonetheless feels like a thread of commonality between these two mothers, one wronged, one doing the wronging in some ways, although it's much more complicated than that. And I think maybe what comes across is that feeling of both are flawed, but both for those very reasons are deeply human. And clearly the commonality is that sense of love that they feel for the children, despite all the ambivalences they might also have about their role as mothers in some ways along those ways as well. So I really responded to them. It felt like I thought the book was wonderful in this regard, that every time I felt like, oh, it's going to come up with a verdict, it resisted that and pivoted and kept me on my toes and thinking into those complex moral questions that are essentially actually complex emotional questions, which I really liked. And actually, for me, the helpful takeaway with that feeling that I think we have as writers and parents, that sometimes the parenting takes time from the writing, but eventually it gives it back to us in some kind of material, I suppose, in some ways. Exactly. So it gives and it takes it, right?
Yes, absolutely. Did you find yourself writing the worst fears after you became a parent? What do you think that's all? What is that instinct about?
I think I remember hearing John Irving talking about this years ago when he was working on The World According to Garp, which I think he was writing when he had young kids. And there's a particularly grim accident that befalls one of the kids, I think, in that book. And I think he talked about it as an exorcism, right? That he wanted to get ahead of that worst fear, but somehow by pushing it into fiction to control it, maybe, but also maybe just to externalize it, I think, in certain ways. Exorcism actually feels right to me. There's a kind of magical thinking involved in that, I suspect. And I think as parents, we engage in a lot of often anxious, and sometimes also optimistic and hopeful, magical thinking on the parts of our children. So fiction feels connected to that, actually. I think our imaginations, I think, are often spurred by our worst fears, and I'm often, as a reader, engaged by that kind of exploration. And I think that there's a lot of that in this book, and it goes back a little bit to the way I think Irving talks about that in Garp as well.
Absolutely.
Hey, I know we're going to get to audience questions in a while, but I want to ask maybe a trickier question, although I think these things feel like they are wonderful qualities that are quietly shadowing the book. I mean, we were leaning a little bit before into the question of how do we write about the other, which always runs into questions of appropriation, I suppose, in some ways. And actually, one of the ways I thought the book sort of addressed that subtly, but also ultimately, I think, triumphantly, is that the book takes as its subject a kind of appropriation. If you're going to take somebody else's child, right? So the technical, ethical, writerly question is dramatized in the book, I think, in really wonderful ways. So I really like that consciousness. It's sort of sly, it's crafty, but it's deeply embedded in the nature of the text. But I was also wondering about, I think there's a line that comes up in the book. I wasn't sure if it was actually in that second passage you read, but it reminded me of this, where the folks in Morocco are very conscious of American tourists coming back, and in a sense, coming back to Africa, right? So it's also that sense of you're a Black writer, African-American writer, writing about a modern day slave, I think in some ways, right? And that bouncing back and forth between historical context, geographical context feels very powerful. And I felt that it was always quietly in the background of the narrative in ways that were really interesting to me and really kind of riveting, actually, I would say. And so I was just intrigued about that sense of often a sense of, folks from the US traveling back to the mother country, right? As in fact, Africa is referred to in the text. And I was wondering how you were thinking about that in the deep background of the book, essentially.
Yeah, and it was so tricky because there are ways when you are a writer of color going perhaps to your sort of continent of origin, as it were. There are ways you blend in. There are obviously ways you will never blend in, and it's interesting because I'm sure you've had this experience of people sort of mistaking you for someone who lives there, and I'll never forget, we were in Rabat one year and this guy came up to me asking me for directions. And I was like, okay, we've been here all summer and we have started to look Moroccan, but it was very tricky. One of the ways I sort of got around it in my head is that none of these people are really from Morocco. And so they all get to sort of make commentary because, it was imperative to me to sort of talk about how Morocco treats its immigrants. That's a huge part of why things happen in this book. It was imperative to me to talk about Mauritanian slavery. It was imperative to me to talk about the way women are treated, here and there. And I had really felt that part of Moroccan life because traveling there as a single mother, no matter how much you blend in, is incredibly difficult. It is a culture where, we had to, my kids always say there was a day we were homeless in Marrakesh. We were sort of turned out of a verba because this woman was like, "Why are you here with no husband?" And I was like, "Okay, bye." And so I knew what that was like, and I felt imperative. It was imperative to describe it, but I didn't dare try to approach that from the perspective of someone who actually is a part of that culture, And so there are very few passages that even pretend to do that. Everybody's sort of looking at the world from their own cultural perspective, and I thought it was really important to have that honesty in the book, because I do understand that I think slavery is pretty much always wrong, but I do understand that there is an entire country of people that does not feel like I do, so I tried to make it sort of a clear pane of glass, as it were, where people were clearly looking at it through their own eyes. But it is incredibly tricky, right? Because you don't want to appropriate somebody's head, right?
Right. And I think it's also that I feel as though there's a narrative which I often associate, I don't know, with work or even figures of the 70s and a little bit in that era of that return to Africa in certain senses, right? And it feels like a generational return, right? It feels as though we're thinking about ancestors, where they might have come from. It's a classic roots idea, right? I suppose in some fundamental way, probably why I'm thinking of the 70s in this regard. And what I thought was so fascinating here is that in the figure of Mardi, the girl who Shannon takes from Morocco back to the US and then eventually brings back to Morocco, in the short span of her life as a child, it's less than 10 years, I think, in that span, probably more like 6 or 7, there's a compression of that movement across generations. Actually, she's been abducted and then gets to go back. And I thought that compression was a fantastic lens to think into some of those spaces. Really complex, but raising really nice resonant issues that seem to flow backwards, and embrace both countries and the histories of both countries in really fascinating and rich ways for me as a reader, I would say.
Thank you. Now, again, to get back to like the whole miracle of revision, Someone just asked a simple question on the first draft, and that was, why doesn't she remember Arabic? And it made me sort of write about this. It's because even she's doing a little bit of moral relativism because she has to, but she's sort of willing herself to forget that she was abducted, to forget where she came from, and just be American. So even she is complicit in her own abduction.
Yeah, no, the psychology of that is fantastic. I could go on doing this. I have several more questions if we get to that point, but I know I should check in with John to see if there are questions out there that he wants to share from the audience at all.
Peter, you're welcome to return to your questions. We have no questions at the moment. I think perhaps our viewers are similarly wrapped as I am by your conversation. So I invite you to return to it, and I will reappear if there are some questions from our audience.
Sounds good. We will get into that in a moment. So the other thing I was curious about, so there are tons of things. I'm fascinated, of course, about revisionary questions, but I also was really interested in, it seems like a story that's grounded deeply in psychological realism. The characters are incredibly persuasive to me. As I mentioned before, the spaces, the territories are evoked in just luminous and immediate ways. And yet it also feels like a book of wonderful style. So we talked a little bit about that polyphonic quality of moving into several voices later on. But there are a number of refrains that come up. I think from the very start, there's this question of what is a choice that feels really important to the text, and it recurs several times during the course of the text. And then you have these just great riffs. I kind of want to describe them as. There's a couple of wonderful passages where Shannon, I think, is thinking into the nature of her marriage, and she gives me the live concert version of her marriage, and then she gives me the studio album version of the marriage, and I love that. But I'm curious about thinking about those lovely stylistic. I almost want to call them curlicues, but they're much more than that. They feel really embedded in the text. But I'm curious about your thinking into that. Was it just pure pleasure? Were you just like, I've got to bust out of this mode and do something else? I'm just curious about that.
Both. I enjoy that sort of place so much, but also it's a technical way of offering everybody a chance to tell their side of the story. So I was trying to find a way in that section, particularly, of sort of, in some sense, offering her husband a chance to speak, even if that's only through his actions, that she's recording. One of my favorite movies ever is Hillary and Jackie. I don't know if you've seen it, but
yeah.
There was that part in the middle where you're hearing the story as if from Hillary's head, and then suddenly you get it from Jackie's head, and it's a totally different story, right? Yeah. And that's always been sort of in the back of my head as a model for storytelling, that everybody has their side of the story. Even, Darth Vader, he has his side of the story. So
all roads lead us back to Star Wars. It's great. No, I love that. No, actually, that's great though, because I do think the two sides idea, and everybody has a side, feels really true, of course, to relationships and to marriages. It's true between parents and children, but especially in marriages or relationships. And I think there are problematic, to say the least, male figures in the book, but I do think you give them a humanity, even if it's a very problematic one or a very flawed one, I think, in certain ways. And they feel as though, maybe this is a kindness I should thank you for, that the men feel very flawed, but you have a degree of forgiveness. So you understand they're trying to be decent, even if they're limited in various ways. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
I'm all about men's rights in novels. We have a question.
Oh, we do, yes. Shall I read this one out for you? Would you like?
Sure.
This is from Barb, who says she's wrapped with the conversation. Great conversation. How does Jacinda keep track of all the moving parts in a novel of complexity? I want to read it. Does she use an Excel spreadsheet, butcher paper on the wall, 3x5 cards? And did she do an outline or follow the story to see where it would lead? And there does feel like a lot of different strands here. So I'm fascinated by this question too. It's a great question.
That's a good question. And I hope my answer doesn't make me feel like sound like some sort of rude, because basically on a first draft, I have no plans. I let the characters say what they're going to say and do what they're going to do. And I always feel like if I just let them go, they will do the most extreme things possible if I'm not planning it, and on the second draft, I go back once I know what the novel's really about. And then I don't necessarily keep track with cards or anything, but I do sort of layer my revisions, and you talk about this in your book too, Peter, that, there are those of us who do, like, there's one draft I did for just character development. There's another draft I did to do this Rubik's Cube thing of, well, okay, if this happens in the plot on page 128, then this had to have happened on 35. So I keep track by revising in this layered sort of stacked way. And yeah. And do you do that as well, Peter?
I do. You have that sort of sometimes that conscious sense. I think I do it a little bit more with stories actually than a novel, but that feeling that this draft is going to try and address this issue. So there's that slight feeling, if things are going well, of building up a kind of coat of shellac, and there's another coat, and there's another coat, and there's another coat. I mean, sometimes the shellac doesn't work, and you have to peel that off and go with another one, right? But I really like the way, because I think this is, and this I suspect goes to the heart of Barb's question, because I think we all feel this, right? We want to have a sense of how do we wrap our arms around the feeling of chaos that I think we encounter as we're engaged in writing a novel. How do we corral this thing where it's going off in all these different directions? And I think that's especially true of novels, of course, just so can sometimes be so diffuse or can go off in so many different tangents. I think in various ways, and often have a large cast to grapple with. But I think what you described early on, I really admire, is that feeling of just feeling your way through it, right? And discovering things along the way and making significant discoveries about the text, even late on in the first draft, and then being able to be open to, I'm going to go back and track back into that and work that back into the text more fully, I think in some ways. That the capacity, I think, to trust that intuition as we just work our way through an early draft. There's a kind of, and I'm not always good at this myself, I should say, there's a kind of high wire act to that, right? There's an act of faith, actually, at some level. It's not just loosey-goosey and everything, let everything hang out. It actually feels like you have to almost have a discipline to say, I'm going to see where this goes. I'm going to let it take me somewhere. And it's a different discipline from I will impose order upon it, I think, in certain ways. And I know out of my own anxieties, I'm often looking to impose order, perhaps sometimes a little sooner than I ought to. And I'm often struggling between that sense of where will the intuition take me? How can I listen to the text or the characters? And that desire to like, oh, I've got to shape this, build it, make sure that I've got some firm foundation. So I was really impressed by that in the book, because it has that organic quality to it as I read it. And I think as a reader too, one of the things that's reflected in that is, even as I sense, well, I've got these two characters, and they do have one very brief meetup early on in the text, which is you making a little promise to us that they'll re-encounter each other as they go forward. There's still that feeling of, I don't know where this is going, right? And I think that's really pleasurable for a reader. It's part of that high wire act. But I think sometimes as a writer, we're worried that the wire is not attached to anything on the other side of the trapeze, right? So we're thinking about just falling into the abyss. But as a reader, I like that sense that I think I know you're going somewhere, but I'm not sure where you're going. That was really pleasurable.
I get so jealous sometimes when when you assign some in-class writing and you watch that moment on your students' faces where it is just, the world is wide open. They have no idea what the end of this thing they're writing is going to be, because they didn't think about it until you said it. And I love watching it sort of take shape, because you're right. I mean, for us, especially with the novels, right? That's often impossible. Like that moment is there when you first start it, and then it gets harder and harder to beat, beat off all the other feelings. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's there because we know there might be, or we hope there will be readers at the other end, and we know there are agents and there are editors along the way as well. So there's always that part of that progression, I think, along the way too. I'm going to ask maybe just one last question. Actually, I was curious about this. You're coming out with a publishing house that I know and love very well, Grey Wolf Press. They are a fantastic press out of Minneapolis. I know you worked with an old friend of mine, Fiona McRae. I'm just curious about, and who's now retiring, which feels like a terrible loss to the editorial business. But I'm getting curious about how that experience was for you.
Oh, it was, they are just so brilliant and amazing. From start to finish. I think the editorial process was just stunningly gorgeous. So many good questions that they had, and they, I was left a lot of freedom, but Fiona or my editor Annie Liu would say just one thing, and it would make me rewrite like 80 pages. So it's a brilliant process. I just think they're all just like geniuses there at Grey Wolf. Just it was beautiful, and they've been so supportive on the other end now that the book's finished as well.
Yeah, no, and as I say, they've done, and I'm going to flash it once more because I love this cover. I think that's just stunning. The colors, everything just seem fantastic to me. So congratulations again.
Thank you.
I see John is joining us, so we must be, I can't believe it already. We seem to be bumping up against time.
No, not at all. We're at the top of the hour, so I think it's a lovely place to stop, and I can't thank you both enough for joining us at Home with Literati. You can of course purchase Mother Country through the store, either at the link in the chat right next to me here, or if you're watching us on YouTube, there's links in the description below me. You'll also find links for a Book the Vote's info page and to register to vote in Michigan if you've not yet done so. Jacinda Townsend, Peter Ho Davies, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati. Thank you for letting us launch this novel this evening, and hope to have you both in the store in the not too distant future. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thanks, John. Congratulations, Jacinda.
Peter. Bye-bye.
Take care all.
Bye.